Good afternoon and welcome to the latest Asian Impact webinar from the Asian Development Bank. Today the topic is Asia's journey to prosperity, past, present and post-COVID-19. Now, Asia has succeeded in transforming itself over the past 5 decades into an economic powerhouse. But will the COVID-19 pandemic put the brakes on the economic and other progress that the region has seen? Well, today, to discuss all those issues, we have with us today Mr. Hal Hill. He is Professor Emeritus of the Southeast Asian Economies at the Ernst Corden Department of Economics at the Australian National University. Professor Norma Mansour, she's the Director of the Social Wellbeing Research Centre in the Faculty of Economics and Administration at the University of Malaya. And Ju Jong Zhuang, former Senior Economic Advisor with ADB's Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. Now, we want to make this a lively discussion. So to kick things off, Yasuyuki Sawada will give a short presentation on 50 years of progress in Asia. Yasu is the Chief Economist and the Director General in the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department here at the Asian Development Bank. Yasu.
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. It's a journey to prosperity, past, present, and post-COVID-19. First, from me, I'd like to briefly summarize the key findings of ADB's new book, and then we will discuss Asia's challenges, especially the COVID-19 pandemic. This book came out of a 3-year-long study by ADB, led by Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department, and involving ADB staff members from various departments and offices. In the 1960s, ADB was established in 1966. Asia was very poor, and feeding a large and growing population was one of the critical challenges. There was pessimism about Asia's prospect for industrialization and broader development, as described in a famous book, Gunnar Myrdal's book, Asian Drama. Half a century on, Asia has emerged as a center of global dynamism. What can explain Asia's economic success in the past 50 years? This book attempts to answer this question. There are many studies on Asian development. One well-known study is the World Bank's East Asian Miracle publication. This ADB book differs significantly from World Bank publication in 2 aspects. One is that this ADB book covers a much wider range of countries and economies. Number 2 is that the ADB book covers a much longer time period. So between 1960 and 2018, developing Asia's, including ADB's 46 developing member countries' economy, average annual per capita GDP growth reached 4.7%, the fastest among the different regions around the globe. Rapid economic growth led to a rising share in global GDP. In 1960, developing Asia's share in global GDP was only 4%. By 2018, it has increased to 24%, including Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Asia's share in global GDP rose from 13% to 34%. Rapid growth also led to a dramatic improvement in Asia's broad development indicators. The rate of extreme poverty declined from 68% in 1980 to 7% in 2015. As we can see from the right chart, with more than 1 billion people escaping out of extreme poverty. Life expectancy at birth rose, and infant mortality rate dropped, and mean years of schooling increased substantially. We tried to uncover the elements of this phenomenal growth of Asian Pacific in the 15 chapters listed here, ranging from structural transformation, technology, education, gender, to macro stability and regional cooperation and integration. Presenting a 600 pages long book within 20 minutes or so is a quite challenging task. So my presentation will focus on three issues. First is to look at the main contributing elements to Asia's economic success. Second is to discuss several issues that have been heavily debated in the context of policy research and discussion on Asian development. Third, to look at Asia's challenges, especially the current COVID-19 situation, as well as the post-COVID new normal. What explains Asia's economic success? Many factors were at play. First, a much more peaceful and stable environment since World War II compared with the previous 100 years. Second, peace and stability led to favorable demographic conditions. The share of working age population increased from 55% to 70% in year 1960 to 2018. Third, freer trade and investment policies in advanced countries enabled Asia to benefit from technological progress and globalization. And number four, starting from a low income level provided the potential to grow faster and catch up. Critically, Asian countries adopted the better policies and created stronger institutions for market-based growth. We listed in the book 9 drivers of growth. While we are under the time constraint today, let's look at some of these 9 key drivers. The first driver is the successful economies relied on market and the private sector as engine of growth, while the state played a proactive role in addressing market failure and supporting the private sector. As we can see from this slide, in the past 50 years or so, in most developing Asian economies, development policy shifted from initially state-led industrialization to more market-oriented growth. Roughly, the period after World War II can be divided into these 5 phases. Half a century of Asian development shows the sustainable growth and poverty reduction require efficient market and effective state and strong institutions. The second driver is to promote structural transformation. Structural transformation has been a key driver of growth and development across the world, whether in developed or developing countries. Asia achieved this stylized structural transformation at a faster pace. Structural transformation also involves a shift of resources, capital and labor, from low productivity production to high productivity production in each of the 3 sectors listed here through technological progress. Growth decomposition, you can see from the right chart, this growth decomposition shows in 1970s and 1980s, Asian growth was driven mainly by mobilizing resources. Physical capital shown in the green part and labor orange part, as well as human capital yellow part. Over time, TFP, total factor productivity, shown in the blue, became more important as a source of growth, reflecting the rising importance of technological progress and efficiency improvements. In the last 7 to 8 years, TFP growth accounted for 40% of total GDP growth, the same as contribution by physical capital stock. The third policy driver is investing in productive capacity. During 1960 to 2017, developing Asia's physical capital stock grew at 7% per annum, from $4 trillion to 176 trillion US. Growth was the highest for PRC, but also high in other sub-regions. High growth Asian economies made large investment in physical capital, financed largely by domestic savings, as we can see from the left chart. A key part of physical capital investment was used for infrastructure, transport, power, water, sanitation, and telecommunications. As you can see from the right chart in this slide, during 1971 to 2018, per capita electricity generation increased by 35 times in Korea, 30 times in China, 19 times in Thailand, 14 times in Malaysia, and 9 times in India, significantly narrowing the gap with advanced countries. Fourth policy driver is human capital accumulation, generating the so-called demographic dividends for high growth. Many Asian economies made efforts to build human capital by making education as a basic right through compulsory education, investment in schools, and education reform. In 1970s to 2010s, public expenditure on education increased by 2.1% of GDP to 3.6% of GDP, as you can see from left chart. As a result, these policy measures, most Asian economies achieved universal or near universal access to primary education. Many achieved universal or near universal access to even secondary education, and there are also significant expansion in tertiary education, as we can see from chart right. As the fifth driver of growth, Asian economies achieved accelerated technological progress. First, they adopted foreign technologies at initial phase, then innovated on their own using a variety of ways. The adoption phase included inviting experts from abroad and also sending students abroad, buying foreign licenses, conducting reverse engineering, importing machinery, and promoting trade and foreign direct investment, FDI. Then innovation phase involved investing in research and development, R&D. Asia's progress in technological innovation has been dramatic. It has transformed from user of foreign patents to a producer of patents too, as you can see from the middle down chart. The right chart looks at the top 5 economies globally in terms of annual number of granted patents in the United States in 1960s in the bottom blue, and the 2015 upper part, red part. In the 1960s bottom part, the top 5 included Germany, UK, France, Japan, and Canada. By 2015, top 5 included, as you can see from the red parts, top 5 included in 2015, Japan, Korea, Germany, Taipei, China, and China. And there are other drivers. So far, I listed 5 or so drivers, but there are other drivers of growth. Over the past 50 years, compared with other developing regions of the world, developing Asia did better in macroeconomic management, whether looking at growth fluctuation, inflation, or frequency of economic crisis. Then macroeconomic stability and acted as an ecosystem of nurturing growth and development in inclusive manner. Rapid economic growth and targeted social policies, land reform, green revolution, education, health, social protection, access to finance, infrastructure, and markets led to rapid poverty reduction, which in turn helped create a stable political environment for growth. However, Asia's picture is more mixed in narrowing income gaps. Asia has stable inequality in 1960 up until 1980s, a pattern known as growth with equity in East Asia. Since 1990s, growth has been accompanied by rising income inequality in some countries. Third bullet point listed here, Asia's rapid growth catch-up has also benefited from bilateral partners and multilateral development banks investing in development, especially infrastructure, education, health sectors, especially at the beginning of 1970s and 1990s. And last bullet point here listed regional cooperation integration has also played an important role in supporting Asian development by promoting peace and stability in the region, as I mentioned before, inter-regional trade, investment, and the provision of regional public goods. So now let me turn to issues that have been subject to extensive debate in policy discussions on Asian development. I will highlight four extensive debates and how the book views these issues. First issue is Asian development unique? This ADB book argues successful Asian economies implemented market-oriented policy reforms that are not very different from standard economic theories. In this sense, Asian development is not necessarily unique. Secondly, the role of industrial policy. The book argues if used badly, targeted industrial policy can lead to rent-seeking, unfair competition, and inefficiency. But if used wisely, such industrial policy can be effective, especially in areas with strong positive spillovers and coordination problems where market solution may be suboptimal. Targeted industrial policy is more likely to be successful when it is performance-based and promote competition with clear targets, sunset clauses, and transparent implementation rules. As a country becomes more developed, intellectual property, the industrial policy should focus more on supporting R&D in order to promote technological innovation that are less distortionary. Third debatable issue is, can industrialization be bypassed? This book did not provide a definite answer, but note that manufacturing was important almost in all high-income countries historically before their industrialization. Secondly, manufacturing has a number of important features: tradability and foreign exchange generation, high income elasticity of demand, large scope for innovation and technological progress, scale economies, and creating better paying jobs. And the fourth point is importance of institutions. We all know institutions or governance is important, whether according to new institutional economics or celebrated the book by Asemoglu and Robinson titled Why Nations Fail. Asia usually has relatively low scores on governance ratings, while its development performance is outstanding. This is somewhat considered as a paradox. This ADB book argues, by and large, there is a positive association between governance and economic development, and Asia is no exception. And finally, I'd like to make a discussion about the post-COVID and the challenges of Asian economy. Asia's development gaps with advanced countries still remain large. In year 2018, developing Asia per capita GDP was just 13% of OECD level. Asian economies should maintain sound policies that prove to have worked and address remaining and emerging challenges. And here I listed the 7 challenges. First, overcoming the health crisis and reopening the economy is a top priority, and how to adapt smart lockdown containment policies. Also, continued effort to achieve universal health coverage. That's a big challenge. Secondly, innovate continuously. That's an emerging challenge or already emerged challenge. Post-COVID, digitization and platform economies are developed. In this situation, can Asia still maintain catching up to OECD and developed economies? Third point is, while we highlighted the inclusive nature of past Asian development historically, there is increasing poverty due to COVID, as well as a gender gap in labor market and potential social and political issues. So this is the third challenge. And the number 4 is under school closure due to COVID. Quality and learning challenges in education has been fiercer than before. And number 5, 1.7 trillion annual investment in infrastructure is necessary according to our infrastructure study 2 years ago. So this may generate a resource competition over short-run response to COVID-19 and long-run investment, necessary investment in infrastructure investment. in order to continue Asian development momentum and also facilitate poverty reduction trend and also achieving global climate goal according to Paris Agreement. Number 6 is Asian growth has been a bit dirty in terms of environment. How to achieve a building back greener, protecting environment and tackling climate change issues. That's really a big challenge. And finally, but not least, rapidly aging society. Whole Asia, this aging putting a downward pressure on productivity and growth in post-COVID-19 recovery. So this is also a mega trend Asia is facing. So these are the very quick summary of 20-minute summary of our book, and also seeing this COVID-19 epidemic and crisis, we can identify several very important challenges Asia is facing right now. So I'm looking forward to join a panel discussion on this respect. With that, I'd like to stop my initial presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yasu. Yes, certainly a lot to think about, both looking backwards, but indeed looking forwards as well. We would, of course, like to hear from you. So please do type your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find on the right-hand side or at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can, but please do also like or give the thumbs up to any existing questions, and we'll try to address the most popular questions first. So while you're thinking about those things, I'd like to perhaps throw out a few questions to the panelists that we have here, just to get a little bit of the lay of the land. And Hal, if I could come to you first, please. We've heard about the overall rosy experience in Asia of the past, but some countries are certainly lagging. Some countries are doing better than others. What do you really see as the unfinished agenda? And are there any lessons that we can learn for the future?
Thanks very much, Karen, and good evening from Canberra, and good morning, good afternoon, and wherever. First of all, I want to say congratulations to the ADB for this very fine publication. I think it's one of the most important publications, ADB authored publications that's been produced. And congratulations, Yasu, for compressing 600 pages into 20 minutes. And a special hello to my fellow panelists, to Norma and to Jujong. So a couple of general points to make, then I'll perhaps get to the question, the very important question Karen raises. I should just mention, by the way, with a caveat, I'm sort of an outsider, but a slightly insider as well, since I was an editorial consultant and advisor to the project. And also, just to say, it's really bad luck, the timing of the publication. The volume was released pretty much exactly as COVID hit, and so everyone's talking about COVID. But when we get through COVID, hopefully sooner than later, we'll get back to these issues. And this is going to be the go-to volume, I think, to try and understand Asia-Pacific economic development. It's also, by the way, a broadly accessible volume. It's of interest to an academic audience, but it's also of interest to a policy and a lay audience. So I think it's a very good piece of work. By the way, also, I've written a review article of it, which is about to appear in the journal, Asian Economic Journal. So my comments draw on that a bit. So I think on the question of if you like, success, which is important in the volume, but also there's diversity. Now, of course, success is much more interesting. There are any number of ways how not to achieve economic development success, but success itself is much more elusive and therefore needs to be studied more. And that's a clear motivation for the volume, as it was for the earlier East Asian Miracle volume, for example. But the volume does draw attention to the great diversity within the Asia-Pacific region in terms of outcomes. And therefore, there's not one single story, as Yasu mentioned, and there's not one single development model. The very first table in the book actually summarizes this rather neatly. per capita GDP growth from the period 1960 to 2018 for the whole region was 4.7%. But within that, there's huge variation from Northeast Asia, in which China is dominant, 6.5%, Central Asia, 2%, and the Pacific Islands, 1.5%. So I want to just probe this a little bit, following up from Karen's question, and ask why is it that there are some lagging regions, and by extension, where's the unfinished reform agenda in particular? So just briefly, I want to take you through what I think are 6 relevant factors which do come out in the book in various forms. Firstly, there are slower growing regions, and in fact, the study itself identifies 2 of the 5 major sub-regions of the ADB operations are in this group, that is Central Asia and the Pacific Islands. It raises the question, is there something in these regions' history, geography, politics, institutions, which explains their slower growth? For example, in the case of the Pacific Islands, is it their remoteness or is it their very small size? In the case of the Central Asian economies, that is the former Soviet Union republics, was it just simply their abrupt exodus from the former Soviet Union, sudden transition from plan to market without the institutional underpinnings to support it, or maybe also isolation? So that's the first general sort of point to make, I guess. Second point to make, which is referred to in passing in the volume, is of course conflict. We know that stability, as mentioned earlier in the book, is an essential prerequisite of successful economic development. Now, Asia Pacific as a region has had less conflict than other major regions, especially Africa, but it's had some. Earlier, it was, of course, the Vietnam-Indochina War, which overshadowed the whole of the region. More recently, I guess you'd say Afghanistan is particularly conflict prone, and that's held back development. So that's the second factor which I think is relevant. A third one is countries that have strong growth potential and sometimes performance, but are held back by recurring macroeconomic crises, and for which they call in the doctor. The doctor, of course, is the IMF with the IFIs like the ADB. And we can think of cases where that has been a feature of their economic history over some decades. Perhaps a country like Pakistan, maybe Mongolia, other countries. So that's another factor which could explain lagging performance. A fourth factor is that some countries deliberately decide not to join the global economy. So the best known example in Asia Pacific is, of course, North Korea, which incidentally wasn't in the study. I don't think it's a member of the ADB, but for a long time, Myanmar was in a sense by choice, decided not to join the global economy. So that's another cause of lagging regions. Myanmar, of course, is now rejoined. A fifth factor, which is perhaps the most important, is that economic development is not a continuous linear process. It's often episodes in economic development where you get periods of slow growth and periods of rapid growth. I think one of the most important features of Asian economic development has been the turning points, especially in the major economies, which often suffered for decades of very slow growth, and then a turning point when a decision was taken explicitly to emphasize improved living standards and more rapid economic growth. So the turning points I often think of are China in 1978, India in 1991, Indonesia 1966. There are plenty of others, Vietnam 1986, but these mark a discontinuity in the development process before with very slow growth and afterwards with much faster growth. There are also countries which have episodes, quite distinct episodes in their trajectory. So a very good example is the country where some of our participants are speaking from, the Philippines. The Philippines was earlier expected to be one of the most successful Asian economies. For some time it grew strongly. I guess that's one reason why the ADB is headquartered in Manila. But then it got into economic and political trouble, and for 2 decades had no increase in per capita income. Fortunately, it's come out of that period and now growing more strongly. So that's another case where we can think of factors which explain lagging performance for some time. A final case just to mention is countries which which have strong performance, but then seem to slow down before they reach what might be termed the frontiers of global economic prosperity. Sometimes this is referred to as the so-called middle income trap, which is a convenient term, but it's not all that useful as a theory, but it's a useful description of the experience of some countries. For example, a discussion of modern Thailand sometimes talks in terms of it being sort of trapped in the middle. And the reasons behind it, of course, are complex. Final point just to mention is that there are some factors which are pretty clearly not the crucial determinants of lagging performance, and these are in passing referred to in the volume. One is whether countries are resource rich or resource poor. The evidence, is it a blessing or a curse? Very mixed evidence, but there's no uniform story. It depends how you manage the natural resources. Another one is natural disasters, sometimes put forward as a reason for countries' poor performance. Philippines, for example, during its difficult times, in those cases, natural disasters was put forward as a reason, frequency of typhoons and earthquakes and so on. But I think the evidence clearly is that good policy trumps natural disasters. So it's hard to think of an argument, except perhaps for climate change in the future, where natural disasters are being a factor in long-term economic growth differentials. Final point is a question of religion and culture, where we simple-minded economists dare to tread, and the volume does mention this in passing. I think the general consensus is one has to be skeptical about the importance of culture, religion, related variables as a determinant. Someone once said, when all else fails as an explanation for economic growth, there's always culture as a last resort. And I don't think it's particularly persuasive. For example, China was poor for a long time and people said it was because of Confucian culture. When China began to grow quickly, people then sometimes said it was because of Confucian culture. So I don't think that's a persuasive argument. So to sum up, we know a lot now about why countries perform well, and this volume throws a lot of light on it. The reasons why countries don't perform as well or lag somewhat, the reasons are more complex. There's no unifying theory, but there's lots of evidence, and quite a bit of it comes out in this volume. So with that, let me thank you for the invitation to speak, and I'll look forward to the discussion and Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Hal. Certainly a lot to think about there, a lot to chew on. And I do see that we're getting questions come in, but just before we turn to those, I'd like to get a few more comments from Norma and then from Ju Jong, if I could. Norma, if I could come to you. Yasu mentioned in his presentation some special circumstances that had helped Asia in the past and maybe a challenge going forward, and that was positive demographics that are turning a little bit against Asia in terms of the aging that we're seeing in many countries. Do you see that being a big problem going forward, particularly with the COVID-19 issue becoming so prevalent?
Thank you, Karen. Interestingly, demography can be both a challenge and an opportunity. Yeah. So as we all know, that all countries in Asia are in the process, or globally, are in the process of aging, and in Asia, especially, is at an unprecedented pace. Although the timing and pace of this transition varies across the region, and as the demographic transition phases that is characterized by by the birth rate and the mortality rate, countries are divided into different phases. Yeah? And for Asia, they are mainly in the fourth phase, which is supposed to be aging rapidly. They are in the second and fourth phase. Yeah? However, the very a key point about Asian countries is that we're aging more rapidly and we are aging before we are rich. So this is one of the challenge, and the protection or the non-familial income and health security systems are weaker compared to the European countries. So this is one of the challenge, and as proven when COVID-19 happened, is still out there, is changing the older people's daily routines, the care and support they receive, their ability to stay socially connected, and how they are perceived. And especially in poor countries where the digital and the network is poor. Yeah? The digital divide further reinforces the challenge faced by the older people. And also the fact that they have to remain indoors, lack of physical contact with other family members, friends, and colleagues, and some of those who are working, is the cessation of employment and other activities had further deepened the anxiety and the fear of illness and death on their own and others. But on the other hand, it can also be an opportunity. The demographic change matters to economic development because many countries in Asia and then the Pacific still have young populations. Yeah, these countries are like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Papua New Guinea, Bangladesh for that matter, in India, Indonesia. So these countries have a relatively younger population compared to the more developed Asian countries. And they can benefit from demographic dividend for many years to come. However, what's important is having the right policy in place. And as Sawada-san mentioned in his presentation, that having the right policies is key in ensuring that economic growth, there is economic growth. And for trying to benefit from the demographic change, the economic policy is also important. Yeah? Having the right policies is important. And the economic growth resulting from the first demographic dividend, where the population, the low fertility rate is also supported by low mortality rate, where you have a bigger percentage of the population in the productive stage of the economy, it enhanced the productivity of the working age population. And this is, of course, influenced by the quality of education, adequate human capital and infrastructure investment, and creation of sufficient quality jobs, as highlighted by the presentation from the chief economist. And if the appropriate labor market and other policies are established to allow for a productive working age population, as well as the promotion of savings that should be accumulated at younger ages, then there is a potential to realize the second demographic dividend. So demographic dividend or demographic gift is not a sure thing. I mean, it is a potential, and if the right policies would definitely support getting benefits from the demographic change. And for aging, if you look at the current older population, their sources of income are from four main sources. They either work, they are majority of the people that we have surveyed also in Malaysia. We have a survey, the Malaysia Aging Retirement Survey, short MARS, where it shows that the majority of 60 and older are still working, although they are mainly in the informal sector. So that's the first source of income that the older persons receive. The second one is from assets and savings. Although in Asia, 2/3 of the Asian population do not have savings for old age. So this is something that Asia can start or can try to do something now instead of being too late in trying to get to either educate for financial literacy, because this could help with savings, and also the type of jobs and improving productivity. The third source of income is social protection. And by and large, except for the more developed Asian countries such as Japan, South Korea, the rest, or Australia, New Zealand, the rest are basically do not have a strong social protection And the fourth type or fourth source is family support. And as we are observing, that family support is slowly reduced because the younger generation, and especially during COVID, as we can see that unemployment and retrenchment are rampant, that the family support is also on the decline, and more younger people are also going for informal type of, or rather the gig economy, where not all, although gig economy is one form of employment, but not all do get good income from this type of business activities. And then you have an issue of aging, and not just aging, but also migration. Some countries are dependent on the transmission of support from their children or family members working abroad. But with COVID, migration of workers and all that is also a factor. If I can also talk about how some countries are getting the institutional reform, where older people or the workforce is encouraged not to retire or encouraged to be in the workforce. So this is one of the ways that to secure income for old age. But I think what's more important is to ensure that, or fundamentally, I think Asians should think of the way we understand or we perceive aging. Aging should not be seen as a burden, but it should be seen as an opportunity. Because there is a group led by Andrew Mason, Yung Sok Lee, and also Professor Ogawa, that looks at the National Transfer Account, the NTA, by looking at the life cycle deficit, where at the young and old age, it is positive that you earn less and you consume more. So, and how families, or rather the social protection, can come in order to support those who are not able to support in their old age. But on the other hand, by having this kind of data, where one can also pursue some very positive economic policies. For instance, providing financial education to the current generation, because when they become elderly, they are supposed to have savings, and also promote health. So good education, good health education, and financial education would support the aging population as well. And that, coupled with a government policy that is that plays aging as part of the mainstream economic development, would be the way forward, or would be positive in understanding or in planning for an aging population. So I would end my comments here, and would love to take questions later. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Norma. Of course, you mentioned a number of income inequalities there. I do want to get to a lot of the questions that are streaming in here. So I'll just very, very quickly go to you, Jujong. If I could ask you to just very quickly speak to this issue of income inequality. Is this something we should have tackled before? And given the situation we are in now with regards to the aging population that Norma mentioned a moment ago, what should we be doing now? And if I could ask you to be brief so that we can switch to some of those questions that are coming in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Certainly, this is income distribution is a very important question. I would say Asia has done an excellent job in reducing poverty, but not so impressive in reducing income inequality. As Yasu mentioned, in 60s, 70s, and the early 80s, Asia was considered as a success story of growth with equity. But in the last 20, 30 years, income inequality has been rising, and significantly in many countries. Now, there are multiple reasons for for the rising income inequality. In one, for instance, is in recent decades, income growth for skilled workers and capital owners has been faster than for unskilled workers, and for labor, of course, unskilled workers and labor, which they are relatively poor. And many countries have also seen rise and growing urban-rural income gaps and regional disparity, and the emergence of many super rich. So now these are often attributed to technological progress and globalization. Now, I have to say that to some extent, the rising income inequality is a part of development process, but it also points to the need for great policy interventions. Now, you mentioned about COVID-19. I think COVID-19 will make income inequality worse by reinforcing some of the drivers of rising inequality in the past. For instance, unskilled workers are more likely to experience job losses and pay cuts during the pandemic because they are easier, because unskilled workers are easier to be replaced. And workers, compared to capital owners, for instance, workers will be hurt more severely than capital owners because firms have the option to substitute labor with machine technology. Further, COVID-19, I think will have this disproportionate impact on vulnerable groups, for instance, micro and small medium enterprises and women and elderly. Now, your question on what do we do now? I think the first, of course, is to contain the outbreak. This is very important. And the second is to protect the jobs and those who have lost jobs and the vulnerable groups through various social protection measures, and also support firms to retain jobs and create jobs. And another thing, of course, is important to combine short-term stimulus with the long-term goal of inclusive growth. For instance, investing more in education and health, and strengthening social protection and social safety nets, as Norman mentioned, and working towards universal health coverage. These are the areas. And also infrastructure, investing in infrastructure that will help to create the jobs. And I think in most Asian countries, there is also room for increasing the role of income redistribution through taxation and fiscal transfer. And compared to advanced countries, in developed countries, the role of income redistribution through fiscal transfer and taxation is still limited. So let me stop from here.
Thanks very much, Jujong. And thanks for keeping it brief. Let's come to some of the questions. I note that our most popular question is from Bibin Vasu, and he firstly thanks you for the presentation. So I'm glad you liked it, Bibin. Thank you for saying so. His question is, how do you foresee Asia going forward? Is it losing the opportunity for progress in economic growth with COVID-19 forcing many countries into lockdown and perhaps slowing the integration process? I'd like to go very quickly to Hal first, if I could. Is that something you could respond to, Hal?
Thanks, Karen, and thanks to the questioner. I could respond to it in either 1 minute or in 1 hour, but I think we want the 1 minute, not the 1 hour, right?
Yes, please.
So just it's a very important question, thanks. Just a few general points, or a few quick points. First of all, the evidence, countries will recover their growth more quickly if they've managed the COVID process better. That is, if they've done smart lockdown, if they've been able to do testing and tracing and so on. So we're seeing a lot of variable evidence across the whole world. And we're seeing a lot of the success stories, relatively speaking, are actually in East Asia. So South Korea, Taipei, China, Vietnam, Thailand as well. So, and of course, China with a very vigorous shutdown now coming out of it. So I think it's going to be a very unequalizing world because of these very uneven impacts. But I think you'd have to say that at the moment, the best prospects for earlier recovery are going to be East Asia. And that, in a sense, confirms the dynamism that East Asia in particular has shown over recent decades. Can I just add, I don't know if time permits, just to mention also the variable effects across developing and developed countries, rich and poor countries. The evidence, I don't think, is yet clear whether it's going to be unequalizing across broad groups of countries. It looks like developing countries may be better off to the extent that they've got larger agricultural sectors and that sector is less affected, maybe because their younger population's less affected. On the other hand, the social protections involved when you do shutdowns are probably weaker because the fiscal resources are weaker. So I think the evidence is still variable. The final point is, it does depend also on how the macroeconomic environment is managed. And that's where some developing countries are particularly vulnerable. To the extent there's been capital flight, if you like, flight to safety out of emerging market economies, that's put pressure on their exchange rates, potentially put pressure on their external indebtedness if it's foreign currency denominated. I think we've got to watch that very closely to see whether the health crisis does have uneven but serious macroeconomic effects across countries.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to address the second question to Yasu, if I may, related to that. It says, is the strict lockdown measures, were they a mistake in Asia, particularly in those countries where the rates of COVID cases are relatively low compared to other countries, perhaps in the US or in Europe? Yasu, if I could ask you
thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very, very important question. As emphasized by Juzon and also other panelists, I think at this stage, containing a health crisis is should be placed on top priority. And whether strict lockdown was too much, I think the question, in order to make assessment, we have to compare the observed situation with the counterfactual situation where government placed a no lockdown at all. And I believe lockdown worked very well to contain health crisis. And therefore, as a result, we are observing not very serious health consequences, but milder than maybe some people expected prior. So I think lockdown has been very effective. But I'd like to emphasize, recapping Har's point, I think inevitably health containment really put the downward pressure on economic growth. So economic growth slowed down this year substantially. Before COVID-19, we ADB forecast this year of developing Asian Pacific region was around 6%. But now our latest updated forecast, Asian Development Outlook Supplement, released last month, said almost 0%. So really major downward revision of overall Asian growth. And then next year, we envision 6% growth. So growth rate wise, a V-shaped recovery, but per capita GDP wise, we don't really recover back to pre-COVID-19 growth trend. So that's our latest forecast. I'd like to mention, related to, again to containment policy, actually many people talk about a very fundamental trade-off between health containment and economic activity. But there are some successful cases, as Haru mentioned. East Asia has been quite successful to wisely avoid this seemingly fundamental trade-off by using a digital test, trace, and quarantine principle. So notable example was Korea, and also Taipei, China did quite well. So I think, and also China. So we can learn from these lessons to avoid really seemingly fundamental trade-off. So I think we have a lot to learn from now on.
Thanks very much. And of course, schools have been affected by the COVID-19 lockdowns as well, very much so. But if we could go back in time, please, and I'll turn to Norma, if I may. There is a question here, an anonymous question, asking about how far the educational attainment of various populations helped the progress of countries in the past. Norma, could I direct that to you, please?
Well, thank you very much, Karen, and also the participant who asked this question. Education is very important. I think it has been highlighted in the book and also in the presentation and our discussions. Because of education, also better educational level in Asia Pacific has also contributed to growth. But I think the challenge now is about quality education and the type of education. So if education is about rote learning, but not about the analytical skills, and also because having that the quality education that we're talking about means that students are able to think critically. That would hope that we're hoping from there to bring about innovation and creativity. So I think it's not just about read and write. Reading and writing is well for an early stage of development and manufacturing. But beyond that, you will need a different kind of education. So definitely it's a yes. But now the focus of governments in the Asia Pacific is looking at quality education. Karen, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are bouncing around a little bit topic-wise, and I apologize for that, but that's the nature of the eclectic interest in the topic that we have today. But we have a couple of questions about agriculture, and I'd like to turn first to Yasu, but welcome any of the other panelists to jump in if they have comments on this. The question is, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the Thai agricultural sector, or indeed agricultural sectors in other economies? And can agriculture now help the economies recover, and how should that be realized? Yasu, could I come to you on that first, please?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So initially, we worried about Thailand and other economy where agriculture or food processing industry play a very important role in whole economy. But it turned out, for example, for China, I think the food and agriculture sector and productions are rather robust against the COVID-19 shock. I think because we can attribute this to, even a pandemic situation, people needs to eat, and also, trade network and, there's a transaction network of Thai agricultural products still kept quite well in spite of COVID-19. Although logistics and actual trading and transport sector, we see some bottleneck, but overall impact on Thai economy, agriculture was not as serious as other sectors such as tourism, where tourism we see a big drop by nature of a pandemic, and that really caused a big loss to Thai economy. So this is the overall summary of the situation and our assessment.
Thank you very much. Yes, agriculture, of course, has become a much smaller part of economies in Asia, but nevertheless still very, very important. We have another question here that I'd like to address perhaps to Hal and then to Du Jong too. And please, Norma and Yasu, please jump in if you have other comments to make. The question is from an anonymous attendee asking if you think that the economic growth in Asia is concentrated in a few countries, Japan, China, Korea, Singapore, etc., and if it has, or why it has not trickled down to the whole region. I think this goes back to some of the comments that Hal, you made earlier about different economies performing in different ways. Could I go first very briefly to you, Hal, and then perhaps to Ju Jong?
So that's a very important question, and I think the story there for Asia is a positive one. That is, Japan was obviously the leader in economic growth way back 50s, 60s. We know it then spread to the so-called flying geese, that is the 4 Asian NIEs, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong. But the story since then has been much broader economic development success. And it does get back a little bit to the point I was making earlier about turning points and countries deliberately deciding to actually join the global economy and enjoy economic growth. And so whereas initially it was concentrated fairly narrowly in Japan and the NIEs, from the 1970s onwards, it particularly began to, several Southeast Asian countries began to grow very strongly, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia in particular. Then, of course, the big one, China, began to join the growth club from the late 70s, and then another big one joined from the early 1990s in India, and also some other South Asian countries. So it's been a spread effect and a very positive story. And I don't think it's coincidental. It's partly because countries seeing their neighbours adopting so-called sensible policies and enjoying the benefits. So that's been a very positive story for Asia. It does also, though, highlight the missing areas, as I mentioned earlier, the gaps in the record. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll turn to Ju Jong too. Perhaps you can talk about these four tiger economies: Korea, Hong Kong, China, Singapore, and the country that we at ADB, of course, call Taipei, China. Ju Jong, any comments from your side?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Ha has said. Basically, now, especially since 1990, the economic growth in Asia is quite broad-based. Asia's growth, as highlighted by Ha as well in the book, started with Japan in 50, right? And then we have NIEs, Korea and Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and Taipei, China. Then after that, around the 80s, and then several Southeast Asian economies, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and then China and Vietnam, as the economy opened up and the market-oriented reform introduced. And from 91, India started the market-oriented reform from 1990 or 1991, and then other South Asian countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all joined this this wave of market-oriented reform. So I think Central Asia, after, of course, the independence from the former Soviet Union, and a growth, of course, Central Asia, there was a period of recession because of the shocks, because of due to the independence from the Soviet Union. And then from 2000, experienced quite a period of good growth. And recent years, of course, because of the global financial crisis and because of the commodity price, resource, and then economy have been affected. So overall, I would say, since 1990, Asia's growth was quite broad-based, and Cambodia and Laos, PDR, and Myanmar, the Bangladesh has been the fastest growing economy I think in Asia for many years now. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes, of course, trade has been very, very important to the growth of the region. And there is another question here about the trade conflict between the US and China, and how and whether that will affect the Asian region as a whole. Perhaps I could come to Yasu first on that.
Yes, this US-China trade conflict is a big issue that has predated COVID-19 and already running over on 2 years. Over the past 20 decades, if we broaden the scope, and based on this book, Asia's overall trade has been a rising trend, and that has been a really source of Asia's continued growth. But now when trade was started a couple of years ago, developing Asia's overall trade began to flatten and taper off. So this has being continued right now during the COVID-19 situation. A couple of years ago, actually 2 years ago, as a part of Asian Development Outlook, we did a formal assessment. What's the likely impact on Asian economy, US-China trade conflict? Actually, the first direct impact is Chinese export to the US slowed down. So countries connected to Chinese producers through supply chain network, these countries will be indirectly affected. So that's a negative impact, definitely we observe. But at the same time, Chinese export slowdown can be captured by other Asian countries which produce similar products to Chinese products and exported the products. So there is another positive element of a conflict which generate the potential gain. So especially according to our study, especially countries like Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries can potentially gain. And this first direct, indirect negative impact, and then trade reduction positive impact altogether seems to be slightly positive impact many countries encounter. So actually this is a assessment. And also in order to facilitate this process, actually we observe just before COVID-19, we observed some investment flowing into from China to Southeast Asian countries. So actually overall US-China trade conflict is not necessarily as serious as many of us really expect. So that's my response to this question. But now COVID-19 and this tapering of trade also kind of fuel. So I think overall gain, including China, to overall gain from the trade seems to be really stagnated. So I think it's very important to re-emphasize the importance of more open trade, so that all the country can gain out of this open trade and investment system.
Thank you very much. We only have a few more minutes left, so I'd like to be very brief, but I do want to end on a very, very important question. And that is related to whether the development that we've seen in Asia so far has been unique. And I'd like to very, very briefly come to each of the panelists, if I could, to give a very, very short commentary on that. Could I start perhaps with you, Jujong? Then I'll go to Hal, Norma, and then back to you at the end, Yasu, if I may.
Yeah. I think my answer would be yes or no. Yes is unique in the sense, I would say no, not unique, because as the book argued that successful Asian countries basically implement the policies which are not that different from standard economics of a market economy, right? It's liberalization and trade liberalization and investment liberalization and the financial sector reforms, all this. So in that sense, it's not that unique. But on the other hand, Asian countries do have some unique aspect. The most important is the implementation. They implement these policies more, gradual way and sequential way, and so the experiment before larger scale implementation. So in that sense, it is unique.
Thank you very much, Jujong. Unique. Okay, that's a thumbs up. Hal, could I come to you, then Norma, and then Yasu, please?
Yeah, so another interesting question. I think, like Jujong said, yes, it's unique in the sense that it's historically unprecedented growth, which Asia has enjoyed over the last 50, 60 years. But it's not a mystery, and that's what the book says too. The book, as Yasu's remarks said, it's not a mystery. It's pursuing kind of the economic policies which we know are growth promoting and lead to rising living standards. But there is one mystery, and that is, why hasn't this successful model been replicated much outside Asia Pacific? We know that in Latin America, there's really only been one dynamic economy in recent decades, and that's Chile. In Africa, of the, whatever it is, 59 countries in Africa, really only been one successful one, Botswana, apart from Mauritius, which is sort of not African. So I think the real mystery is not so much the Asian puzzle, which I think we understand quite a bit about now, and the book helps us understand it. But why it hasn't been, why the model hasn't been adopted elsewhere in the region. Maybe that's outside the ADB's remit, but of course the other regions should and could learn from the Asian experience.
Thank you very much. So that's unique, but not necessarily copied so far. Thank you very much, Norma.
Well, thank you, Karen. I think all of you should read the book because it's very clear in the book that what are the elements that has brought Asia to where it is today. And it's not unique, as mentioned by the others. The book wrote that as well. It is about an open economy. It is about doing, having policies that support growth and all that. But my also, I have a concern whether the issue of institutions and governance, if we can continue to reform this. Because corruption is an issue in Asia, is still an issue, is prevalent. So if we can continue to work on the institutions and the governance side of it, and also take into consideration the new challenges of the aging and also the digital economy, I think Asia can maintain its success. But as I said, if we do not have the right institutions and the right form of governance, then perhaps that will be a test for us. Yeah, thank you, Karen.
Thank you very much. So some tasks ahead. Yasu, please, the last word to you.
Yeah, actually, yes, I'm recapping other panelists' points. I think basically we see the pattern. Successful Asian economies really implemented the market-oriented reform. So in that sense, really government play a key role to correct market failure and also strengthening resource allocation mechanism market. And as Hal said, some African countries, we can replicate Asian model. And we actually see East African countries like Ethiopia, we see a really Asian type, labor intensive industries led the growth. And also before that, we already see Bangladesh. 2 decades ago, people call Bangladesh as a basket case of development, although I don't necessarily like a term basket case. But now we see, Bangladesh is a really fastest growing country among the all Asia, 8%, 9% growth. That's amazing. And that became really possible following, government industry, labor intensive industries, driven growth, and also absorbing a huge amount of workers and especially women, so that this whole growth process, inclusive growth, turn into really correcting agenda bias and empowerment, contributing empowerment of women. So I think this market-oriented reform and using a market mechanism is really critical. But having said this, I also agree with Norma. Government mechanism is not panacea. So we need to really observe and also support governance reform in order to minimize negative aspects of government intervention. So I think, but overall, market failure corrected by the state and also governance or government failure needs to be further corrected. I think this is really like a textbook development case we are observing. So I think also in the book we said Washington Consensus list of reforms and policy changes we really observe in Asia. So again, overall this book basically said the Asian development is not necessarily unique, and there is no secret behind Asian development. So I think that this is a major like a position of this ADB book.
Okay, thank you very much. So many successes in the past and certainly some lessons and some challenges going forward as well. Well, thank you very much for your participation. We've come to the end of our scheduled time. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to get to all of the questions. For that, I apologize, but it was a rich and fruitful discussion nevertheless. I'd like to thank all of our expert panelists here, Professor Hal Hill from the University of Australia. Thank you very much. Professor Norma Mansour from the University of Malaya, Juzhong Zhuang Thank you very much. Former economic advisor with the ADB's Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. Thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, our host, Yasuyuki Sawada, with
thank you.
the ERCD Department, the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. Again, thank you very much for your time.
One thing I forgot
Thank
to
you.
mention, this book is available from ADB website for free. So Asia's prosperity to Asia's journey to prosperity. So you can check this book. Also 500 pages, but I gave you 20 minutes.
600 pages.
So 600 pages, including index, etc.
Yeah.
So
Thank you very much.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So Asia's Journey to Prosperity, Policy, Market and Technology over 50 years. Yes, it's on www.adb.org and it is there for free, of course. The next Asian Impact webinar will be on the 21st of August at 4 p.m. Manila, Hong Kong, Singapore time. Please join us again. Thank you very much.